What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another live stream. And today I'm so happy to be joined by Movieman and Chad Sabourin. So last week I talked about Captain America Civil War as I wanted to start doing these live stream series and having two new guests on every week to talk about a movie. Full spoilers, just something newer, something older, something niche, something big, whatever the case may be. And I wanted to start covering the MCU films that I had yet to cover here on the channel, and realized after doing the stream last week, or right as I was doing it, that I made a massive mistake and completely forgot that I hadn't covered Antman, which should have been what I covered last week with Mike of Did You See That and Adam of What the Gym. But instead, we're covering it this week, so we're going back. And then next week is going to be Doctor Strange. But today, very happy to be joined by these two. You guys can find the link to their channels, of course, in the description box as usual. Movieman, Chad, how's it going?
Good, man. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure, man. I'm glad to hear you guys are doing well. And I was just telling them right before we got started that I'm going to be little purposely choosing individuals for certain reviews. Some people that I just think it'll be funny to hear their thoughts on a movie, or people that I just think it's kind of silly to hear them talk about it in general. And something I love about the three of us, and I've always appreciated, is that we all love film and really like to have well-spoken reviews. We don't necessarily go for humor all the time, even though we all have humor in all of our videos, but it's really about the craft on a deep level a lot of times. And I figured, what a better movie in the MCU to have these two join me for, as we're talking about Antman, who is, I guess you can easily say, one of the silliest premises of any Marvel character. Even as a kid, I'm a huge fan of comic books. I'm a huge fan of the Marvel world. I always loved Antman. He's one of the founding members of the Avengers in the comics, or at least the original version, Hank Pym, who is in this film. But I've always just thought he was a silly character, right? Like the idea of Antman. So when I heard the movie was being made initially with Edgar Wright kind of attached to direct it, which they ended up releasing test footage, that didn't end up happening. He's still, I believe, credited for the writing portion of this film. I was really excited to see what they were going to do. So D, we'll start with you. How long had it been since you've seen the movie, and how do you feel about it all these years later? Now, especially after we've seen him in multiple films and with his own sequels.
So it's probably been a few years. I feel like the last time I watched it was probably around 2019 or something like that. I always have recurring experiences watching films or introducing friends to films that they haven't seen. So I know I've at least watched it a handful of times, definitely a handful of times since it was released, but probably since 2020 and the last few years, I hadn't seen it in a while. So a couple of things I forgot about. I have a pretty extensive memory, but there are some things I actually forgot about, which was a pleasant surprise. But Antman, to me, even when it was first announced, it was something I was always excited for. And I feel like that, along with Guardians of the Galaxy, and maybe for more mainstream fans and people who maybe weren't comic book fans specifically, I remember just the response to that was just what's this? What's the point? And so on and so forth. And I felt like I was the only person, at least in my peer group, that was just I'm here for both of these, and I'm excited and I'm hyped. And I felt like both of them really delivered. And then, of course, with Antman, it definitely stands out as one of my favorite MCU origin films, and that still has not changed. And rewatching it was just a reminder of that.
Yeah, I kind of have to agree. Where I going back and revisiting it. My buddy Rob, who everybody knows, the Big Rob Theory, who lives here with me as well. He was in his room for the first portion of the movie. He came out and watched the last half with me, and he was just oh man, I forgot how much I liked this movie. And I think in an age now where we have all these origin stories that just don't feel like they're going anywhere, or on the flip side, feel so entangled to the rest of the MCU that they don't stand on their own. It's nice to go back to a time where outside of the Falcon element that we'll talk about, I'm sure, the movie kind of just stands on its own. There's mention of that bigger universe and the other characters, but it doesn't really rely on you having seen all that. Whereas now it's you kind of have to be in it all to almost to its detriment. You can't enjoy something like Loki without having seen everything that came before. It's just not possible, even though that show is, at least for me, a great time. So what about you, Chad? I read your review, so I know a little bit of what you felt like this time around. I read your review on Letterboxd, but what are your thoughts after all these years, and how do you feel the character of Antman has kind of progressed since this film with all the other installments?
So it's interesting. I have such a nostalgic spot for this movie because I've only seen it once prior which was in theaters back in 2015, and it was my second review that I ever did on YouTube. So it's always going to have that soft spot for me. I remember seeing it in IMAX 3D and really, really liking it. But I was also scared to revisit it after nearly a decade. And especially knowing that Edgar Wright was originally supposed to direct, and I love Edgar Wright. But I'm happy to report back, I didn't like it as much, but I still enjoyed it. It's nice to see a movie that stands on its own and doesn't have to be where you have to watch all these other different movies. It's nice that anyone can watch Ant-Man and enjoy it. And I'm not gonna lie, I went into Ant-Man the first time very skeptical because I'm like, Ant-Man, what? So that's like Adam in the DC comics. I'm like, what's the difference? But I enjoyed it, and I'm happy to say that I had a good time with this on a rewatch. So, but again, it was 2 watches in almost 10 years. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, so let's touch on what this movie is about for anybody who's unfamiliar, or maybe it's been a little bit. The movie focuses on Scott Lang, who in the comic books came a little bit over 10 years after Hank Pym's version of the character. So when I first heard that personally as a comic book fan, I was like, wow, I'm so surprised, that we got Avengers finally and all this kind of stuff. And like, number one, that him and the Wasp weren't part of that founding team in the movie. That was like, okay, that's a departure. When they announced it, though, I like the idea of an existing Ant-Man who had his own adventures, and now we have this newer version. But I was surprised that they chose to go the route of making Scott Lang's version the main one. I guess for me at the time, it would have been equivalent to like if we hadn't had a Spider-Man movie yet, but the first live-action Spider-Man was Miles Morales versus Peter Parker. Like that's how it felt to me at the time. But now at this point, Scott Lang feels like the definitive Ant-Man in most things. So yeah, the movie opens up and gives us a flashback. We get to see like a young Michael Douglas. We've seen a lot of progression in the de-aging world, and sometimes it's not all that great. So D, I'll start with you. How did you feel going back to this? Because this is one of the earlier like things that Disney had done with the de-aging, if I'm not mistaken. How did you feel going back and seeing Michael Douglas de-age? Did you like seeing that sequence, or did it not hold up for you?
I would say not even just holding up. It actually, because I remember in my mind at the time, kind of thinking it was fairly impressive. But I feel like maybe now, and maybe it's because we've seen so much, let's just say, unsightly effects when it comes to de-aging and all that kind of stuff. To me, and some people may have a more critical eye when it comes to those things. But I think even with what I do know and can appreciate about CGI, to me, it was fairly well done. To me, it's not the same, because I would say another experience I had with that was with X-Men: The Last Stand, where they open up with Professor X and Magneto when they're meeting Jean for the first time. And I feel like at the time it was just like, whoa. And I remember rewatching it, who knows how many years after the fact, and I was just like, oh, okay, this is giving mannequin and plastic and wax. Like it's yikes. But it was good for the time. To me, it still held up pretty well. Actually, I was kind of looking for the flaws. I would say maybe there were probably a couple of times where like maybe the movements were slightly off, but to me, it was actually pretty impressive.
Yeah, no, I would say that I kind of felt similarly going back and revisiting it, that it still looked pretty good. Michael Douglas is in there, and that one of X-Men is a good example that you mentioned there. Because it just what's it called? It did kind of have like this massive uncanny valley kind of look, and then of course now that's made even worse by the fact that we have like all those prequels that timeline wise make zero sense now with that sequence, that just are a mess. Really quickly, not a big deal, but I did notice there's an echo coming from your side, Chad. I muted you a couple of times there while D was talking, so if you had headphones or something, that would be cool. If not, don't worry about it. Or you can go get some headphones after you say your bit here. It wasn't too bad, but I was just thought I'd bring it up. But what about you, Chad? After all these years, how did you feel about the de-aging element of this film?
So surprisingly, so when the camera was like coming in and we see from behind, I'm like, oh right, this is gonna be Michael Douglas like older. But then when he turned around, I was like, oh, that was just like him when he was in like Basic Instinct, Fatal Attraction. I was like, it's not that bad actually. Like I actually think it held up pretty well. I'll take it over like what was it, Rogue One, like that was like uncanny valley. But this was fine because they used it sparingly. It was only like a couple shots for the most part. They knew that use him like from behind and everything, you'll be able to sell it more. So I was honestly really fine with it. And then mention with what you were saying, Anthony, I actually don't have headphones, but I do think, let me go to audio. Let me see if this does anything.
Yeah, they usually have like an echo cancellation option there or something. And it wasn't that big a deal. Like, and worst case scenario, if I keep hearing it and like D's talking or I'm talking, I could just mute your mic here on my side, and then like when I address you, unmute it. Totally zero issue whatsoever. I'm not stressed about it at all.
I was gonna bring my my AirPods.
You're good, man. Trust me when I say I'm not even stressed about it at all. Like the amount of times we've had little technical issues. I've had times where I've started streams and my whole computer froze and I'm just sitting there. I remember one time I had Mike on. You guys can look back and look at a random rambling I did where Mike was I had him in like a rebel outfit from Star Wars in the thumbnail. And at the very beginning I started and I just was frozen. And then Mike is just sitting there. He goes, I think Anthony's frozen. So hi everybody. And yeah, it was a moment. So yeah, I really it doesn't bother me at all. But yeah, I kind of feel similarly that I think for the most part that beginning portion looks good. So we kind of get the setup of the fact that the government and Stark, we get to see Howard Stark here, of course, played by the same actor who I can't remember right off the top of my head right now, who's appeared in multiple. What is his name?
His name's John Slater. He was in like Mad Men and Spotlight.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So yeah, I've always loved seeing him. I just saw him last week in my rewatch, of course, as well in Civil War, where he dies. And spoilers for that if you haven't seen it already, nearly 10 years later, which is crazy. It's crazy that we're nearly 10 years from these movies. That's the part that feels weird. But yeah, getting into the meat and potatoes, we're introduced to Scott Lang, who was a cat burglar, ended up kind of doing a bit of a martyr Robin Hood style kind of robbery in a way. Yeah, he ends up getting sent to prison, gets out, and he just wants to kind of restart his life. I really like that portion of the film, the father trying to make right by his kid and coming back. I love that scene with him and his ex-wife where he's outside and he's like, I've missed so much time. I want to be a part of her life. What do I do? I thought that was all handled really, really well. And then, yeah, we're introduced to these, three bumbling idiots that want to help him, of course, with Michael Pena being one of the main ones, T.I.
He's the highlight of the movie. Anytime they do those sequences where he's like telling a story, I love it.
Yeah, I have to agree. I love that element. I love that whole group. Essentially he's fake heist or is tricked into stealing the Antman suit from Hank Pym. Of course, I'm paraphrasing here. It was all a plan so that he could see if he was skillful enough for the heist they actually need, which is at the very end of the film, to steal the yellow jacket suit and the tech, obviously, from Darren, who of course is the villain, creates the same thing that the Ant-Man was, but of course more of like a military weapon, and he's going to sell it to the wrong people. And so Scott ends up helping Hank Pym as well as his daughter Hope to achieve that goal. And of course, there's a bunch of story that we're going to talk about that happens in the mix. So how do you feel? We'll start with you this time, Chad. How do you feel about Paul Rudd in the role of Scott Lang after all these years? Do you think he was the right choice, or has that always been something that bugs you?
See what you did there. No, I think Paul Rudd's really good in this. I think that similar to Robert Downey Jr., he's able to take what he was known prior, being in these raunchy comedies, and it's like you throw it out the window. You don't even think of him as like, the person that was in 40-Year-Old Virgin. Like you see him as Scott Lang. I think he is so good in these. Even though I didn't like the third Ant-Man, I still think that he is such a good actor in this role, and he provides really good comedic timing and also dramatic heft when need be. So I'm personally really happy that he was in this role. So he worked a lot.
Yeah, I agree. He gives the Paul Rudd performance, right? Like, and having just seen I just watched last month Ghostbusters, the newest one. I saw it twice in theaters. I saw it the first time at a press screening, and then I went with Rob to see it a second time. And so, Paul Rudd is kind of known for a very similar performance. But I really do enjoy. I really do thoroughly enjoy just his performance overall in this role. Again, I think that father-daughter dynamic and the young girl they cast as the daughter as well. She's so cute in this movie. I really enjoy that element, and he really is able to kind of create a character that you can get behind, even though he did go to prison. Like they give you enough, and I think that Paul Rudd brings this charisma that allows you to get behind him. What about you, D? How do you feel about Paul Rudd in this role after all these years?
Yeah, Paul Rudd is one of those, like, I always have actors that I've kind of, well, either grown up with or was introduced to at a very young age. So with Paul Rudd, it was Clueless. Clueless was just one of those very quirky films that I just always found to be interesting as I was growing up. And so, of course, he was a significant character in that film. So it was one of those things where circling around, I liked how, and I think it kind of speaks to at least my perception of the MCU, where we would see it would either be introductions to certain actors or reintroductions to certain actors, kind of a reboot, restart to, you know, their career. And I'm seeing them being utilized in these stories in a very unique and interesting way. And I like the fact that with Paul Rudd, it probably, again, I don't know how people would interpret or what they would expect based off the comics, but Paul Rudd, maybe for some, wouldn't be the most likely candidate for the role. And I kind of like that they went with something that was, as I assume, was kind of different and out of the box. And I like the fact that with his performance, you kind of get layers. You get quirkiness, you get silliness, but you get poignant moments. Like, you get a little bit of everything with his performance. And as he, you know, kind of embodies Scott and all of his complications and quirks, I think he was a solid choice.
Yeah, I'd have to say I agree. I love him in the role, and I think it's nice to know that all three of us, and I think most people in general, really enjoy him in the role. Now, one character that tends to get the most gripes from people in this film, and I don't think it necessarily has to do with the actor, but is the villain, of course, Darren Cross, Yellow Jacket, who, of course, ended up choosing to do the very strange MODOK thing with in the third film, which I know that both of you guys are not really a fan of. I know, D, I remember seeing you post some stuff very vigorously against it around that time. So I want to kind of touch on that too, because it's funny rewatching it. Like I said, I watched it with Rob this last time. He watched the end with me, and there's this end sequence, just to quickly jump into the end, where of course Scott jumps, you know, whatever what does he says, he kind of splits through the atoms or goes between the molecules or whatever. He ends up going God, what's that term? I can't believe I can't remember. Subatomic. Yeah, he goes subatomic. And of course, there's that kind of almost grotesque way that, you know, Yellow Jacket is kind of contorting as he's kind of like shrinking. And it's like, looks so cool. It's like, what a great way to defeat a villain. Only for us to know later on, he just turns into a little ball man, and we get to see his butt cheeks 2 movies later. So Chad, we'll start with you again. What are your thoughts on Corey Stoll as the character of Darren Cross, and what are your thoughts on the villain Yellow Jacket as a whole, and, you know, kind of where he went with the next 2 movies?
So I guess I'll first just say this: Corey Stoll is an actor that in 2015 I was watching, like, House of Cards, and I'm a fan of that show. He's in that, and he's really good. He has, you know, a lot of layers and nuance. So I was disappointed in 2015 with, you know, just such a one-dimensional villain where it's just like, oh, he's bad. There's no real layers to him. And then upon rewatch, it's the same thing. Like, he's a pretty forgettable villain. And then, especially knowing now how he ends up in Ant-Man 3, I'm like, it felt like they just really didn't know what to do with him. They just needed to have a villain. So they were like, okay, let's just have him here. So I wasn't a fan. And I just also really didn't like what they did with him in this, especially in 3. I really can't stand the third Ant-Man. The second one I think is fine, especially in terms of setup for Endgame. But yeah, I mean, it's not as bad as the third one. I'll just say that.
Right, yeah.
I just think it was a waste of potential.
Yeah, I think I agree. Upon rewatch, he is just kind of like the mustache twirling villain, so to speak. You know, like, he has motivation. I think what's frustrating is that, like, the actor is solid, and he has good motivation for wanting to be, you know, kind of. There's this jealousy, kind of like, you know, the whole mentor element between him and Hank Pym that I think gives him good motivation in the film. But ultimately, I just feel like they never did a lot with it. D, what about you? What are your sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if they fleshed it out more, I feel like that would have been compelling. But because it just kind of felt like an afterthought, because they didn't show any flashbacks of, like, him where it was like, okay, so he is like a father figure. It was just like in the present. It's like, oh yeah, you were like a father figure, and that's why I'm doing all this. And it's like, oh, okay. Like,
right.
Film is a visual medium, like, show, don't tell. You know?
And the movie does this interesting thing where you have, like, a lot of time, like with Scott learning the whole Ant-Man suit. There's all these fun montages, and the movie is fun throughout all that. But then the character Darren pops up again at a certain point. You're like, oh man, I totally forgot about this motherfucker. Like, I totally forgot this guy was in this movie. So D, what about you? What are your thoughts on the villain here and what they did with him in the third film?
Yeah, I do think also that Corey Stoll is a good actor. I've seen him in a few different projects, but I think it's kind of one of those things, and I don't want to. Well, I wouldn't say it's because for a second I was going to say, like, is it one of those things where it's a symptom of like origin story, like villains? Maybe, maybe not. I think it depends on the film, especially as we continue to go on. But I think it's just one of those things where with some of the origin films, because it's introductory, so to speak, it's almost like the villain that we get isn't going to be the big bad, or isn't going to be the one that, like we have to have bigger stakes down the road. So it's not going to be that villain, so to speak. So I do think that it's one of those things where I think conceptually, like the look of Yellow Jacket and all of that is really, really cool, really interesting. And even the moments he has where he just fries the one guy and turns him into goo, and then just like, all right, see ya, and then flushes him down the toilet. So like you have moments like that, and it's cool. I just think we don't, as of course, when it comes to depth or development of the character, we just don't get that much. And I feel like one of the, like, what I appreciate, or just the piece I enjoyed about the film, are its flashbacks, not just the 1989 sequence, but the Ant-Man and the Wasp, back in the day, and what happens to Janet and so on and so forth. So I feel like they could have easily had a moment, even if it was brief, to kind of include that and flesh that moment out. Yes, the character still would have been probably a little goofy, but give us a little more than just the gosh, man, yeah, it's time. Like, like we need a little more.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that's something that we all universally agree on. They didn't do enough with them. What were you gonna say? Go ahead.
And I do want to say, like, not to compare and contrast, but if you want to compare another Marvel villain, like, let's look at Black Panther. Killmonger technically isn't in the movie that much, but when he is there, he brings up a lot of moral questions. This villain in Ant-Man, he doesn't bring up any questions until like the very end, and by then it's too little, too late. Like Killmonger, when I watch Black Panther, I am constantly compelled by like him, and also that could just be because Michael B. Jordan also just really elevates the material as well. But I do think that also is a stronger script and villain. So I just wanted to say that because I think that, yes, a lot of people, including myself, do criticize Marvel villains, but they can be compelling, as well as like Thanos.
Right.
But Thanos had a whole movie, like 3 hours. So.
Right. No, but I do agree though, and then there's been other like movies maybe that kind of like wasted certain villains, but like there's been at least interesting or compelling villains. Another good one for me is like I've always enjoyed Michael Keaton as Vulture in Homecoming. He just had fun with that. Yeah. It was silly, and then they end up tying him to the love interest, in this interesting way for that reveal near the end where he's like, the whole prom thing or the dance or whatever. So I think that they did a good job. Whereas this one, like I said, there's a whole segment of the movie that's just them doing the whole Ant-Man thing, which is all fun. Him jumping through the keyhole and all this stuff with him going down and meeting all the different ants. Like I thought that was great. But yeah, they don't seem to do enough with him. Now, one big thing that this movie had to get right in order to be successful, to even be a movie, is the visual effects. So D, we'll start with you. How do you feel about the visual effects nearly 10 years later in terms of all the shrinking and the growing and obviously having a bunch of, in the moment giant ants, that are walking around him and him having to kind of be in the same location and change all these sizes, and then all these fight scenes where he's, punching a guy on his shoulder and then like ripping the one guy over with the tie, and he's got to turn from small to big. If none of that worked, it would not have been a movie that can happen. So D, how do you feel about the visual effects after all this time?
Yeah, I would say like because I when I used to still do like kind of Instagram mini reviews, I had said that I liked the fact that this film literally and figuratively, because of course we have these films, these big stakes, and we have the Avengers, we have these massive villains who want to take over and destroy the world. We have to stop, like all these things happening. And the fact that we literally and figuratively have a character that like has a like a small contained story. It's, you know, the ability to shrink, like the vantage point is like as far away from space and all these massive things as you can get. And I felt like the visuals kind of added to that. Like one thing I really enjoyed is whenever, at least there were two specific moments, the first one being in the bathtub, but it's like he shrinks and you see him shrinking, and then you see the vantage point then as he falls all the way down, and then all of a sudden you see like how everything has shifted, and now he has like, you know, how easily everything changes when everything is suddenly like, you know, this massive gargantuan size. So for me, and then of course when we see things oversized that shouldn't be, which of course, like towards the end, I don't know if it's too soon to say, but you know, certain things that we see, even something like lifesavers, seeing those get smashed apart while they're fighting inside of a suitcase. So I like how it kind of played with scale and size and vantage points and all that. And as someone who of course grew up watching Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, it was a nice little nostalgic tie-in, at least in my mind, that way as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that was definitely an approach that they were going for you know, I think there was definitely some Honey, I Shrunk the Kids kind of vibes to it. And that sequence where he first tries on the suit with the bathtub and going on through all the different like apartments and like the coming into the big rat and all that kind of stuff, even down to the final gag where he's just a little thing that hits the top of that guy's car and he's like, what the hell? Right. And then he grows bigger. Like all that I thought was super fun. What about you, Chad? How did you feel about the visual effects after all this time? And I'm also curious, and I'll throw it back to you in a moment, D, but I'm also curious your thoughts on the cinematography. I know it's a big thing for you when you talk about movies, and this movie kind of had to do a lot with cinematography to make some of these moments, especially when he's flying on Antony. All those moments had to work. So what are your thoughts on the visual effects and the cinematography of it all?
Yeah, so going off what Dee was saying, I agree. Like, I think that with this movie, biggest thing with the visual effects is scale, and this movie did such a good job of really establishing that. Like, I love the action scene at the end where Thomas the Tank Engine, he looks really big, and then we see the shot where it's like he's actually just really small, and it's like you just see it. It's like I love that. I do think it holds up like pretty well. There were some shots where you can tell that there's certain sequences where it's fully CGI, and those were elements that 9 years ago I didn't really recognize, but now I was able to recognize right away. But for the most part, I think it did a really good job, and I think it set the template for what we would see later on with, you know, not only the other Ant-Man movies, but also the Avengers movies and those as well. In terms of cinematography, it's funny because watching this, I was curious. I was like, this movie looks like it's a mix of like shooting on film and digital, and I looked it up, and this was during that midpoint in the MCU where they were shifting from shooting all film to then shooting digitally, and you can definitely tell it's between that line because there's some shots where it's look really strong in terms of the colors, but then there's other shots where it has that, like, I know I said it in the your Civil War stream, Anthony, but it has like that gray, it's this gray like hue where it seems like it's almost like slightly desaturated, and it's something that bothers me in some of the MCU movies because it's like when I think of superhero movies, I don't think of, you know, like gray, like almost like noir. Like I think of bright, colorful, like something like, I'm trying to think of some other MCU movies. Like you know, I always use the Black Panther movies as the gold stand lines, the gold, right, because those ones do a really good job of, they are bright, they're colorful, they are energized. Like looking at that, you are constantly visually in tune. But then there's other ones where it's like I kind of am tuned out by the visuals and I then focus more on like the audio front. So this one, I think, is a fine in between where I think that it was visually appealing enough, but it wasn't like, oh my goodness, like incredible, like for Ragnarok or the Black Panther movies. So yeah, I would say it's passable.
Guardians is another good one that, with like color wise, they always, there's always vibrancy to that world. What about you, D? What are your thoughts on the cinematography of the film?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it does what it's supposed to do. And I do wonder sometimes, I do wonder, thinking about it as we've discussed it, some of that maybe some of the disjointed nature of it, or maybe some of the disconnect might come with Edgar Wright's influence and then shifting over to a new director. And so maybe some of that was a little bit of a back and forth between the direction and maybe the style, and then figuring out what that should look like going forward. But yeah, I think it's solid enough for what it is. Like you said, it's not of course up to the standard of something like Thor Ragnarok or Black Panther, but I think it does what it needs to do. It certainly is not, this is just me personally, but it is certainly not a complete eyesore like Quantumania was. Like, I had such a headache after Quantumania was over. I was just like, this is just so far away from anything visually, appealing that I could imagine. Not even just from a green screen, no, practical sets. Like, it was so for me. So I think just that alone, and maybe just in contrast to that, this is great by that standard. But yeah, does what it needs to do.
Well, yeah, fair enough, for sure. And I'll throw it right back to you, D now, and then I'll throw it over to Chad. One thing I'm curious about for both of you guys, all three films are directed by Peyton Reed. And he, I think kind of nailed it here, at least, for the most part, gives a very, great introduction to this character. You understand, especially seeing where the movies went. I think this movie does a great job of setting the groundwork of, kind of them, chasing, Hank's, believed, dead wife, Janet, who would obviously reappear in the next film. But they set up kind of all that, the relationship between Hank and Hope that I do want to touch on as well. What do you guys think happened when it comes down to the next two films? Because I think it's one of those situations where if it was a different director each time, it maybe would have felt like, okay, I can see why the vision's a little disjointed here. But instead, it was the same director doing a trilogy. And by most people's conversations around these movies, it seems like each one got worse for everybody. Maybe some people prefer the second one, but it seems pretty universal that the third one is everybody's least favorite. So what do you think happened? Do you think it's studio interference? Do you think it's kind of like trying to be a part of that bigger picture of the MCU? Or do you think that Peyton Reed just didn't have it in him for the next two?
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like in general, let's just take even the MCU piece away. I think it's always going to be difficult for any director, even a really, really solid director, to do a follow-up to a film that has been successful, even a competent, decent film, and then trying to extend that story and find a way to recapture everything that you did right the first time and still expand and do more. So I want to just acknowledge that I know, when it comes to direction, I know it's challenging because you want to still have that standard for what you created. I do think that, I guess, in lieu of everything we've seen since then, I do wonder, I still wonder if Antman was being introduced now, or even in phase 4, something tells me it wouldn't be made the same way. And I don't think that simplicity and just kind of that quaint, quirky, kind of low stakes nature of it, I don't know if it would play out the same way. I think some of it, we've seen the studio interference piece, and we've seen where directors have kind of clashed, or even directors have left because of their vision and what the studio wants to do and the way they want to, tie in and things like that. So I'm pretty sure that is part of it. And I just think that with this massive, these kind of world spanning multiple film arcs, I just think it's possible, and maybe along with Peyton Reed trying to figure out how to continue the story, that there just wasn't enough to find a way to, I don't know, to reach that. Because I would say the same thing also about Iron Man. I enjoy Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, but to me, neither the second nor the third film ever reached it never reached, at least for me personally, how effective and how enjoyable that first Iron Man was. Fun films, yes, but I think it's just one of those things where it's kind of the law of diminishing returns. You add in the studio interference, you add in all these other things that you have to, be mindful of and maintain, and then you get something that doesn't really reflect a true vision of the director, or in this case, or also the artist and the core story that we have there.
Yeah, no, I think you made really good points there. I do think it's kind of like it's a mixed bag, right? And it is tough for a director to come back and do something a second time, especially with so many hands in the pot and being part of a big franchise, and then trying to appease fans too, which is a thing I hate that is happening in these days and age, where the criticisms online, there's almost an attempt to try to tackle all of it in a way that ends up just making the finished product worse than it would have been if they just had kind of stuck to their guns. A good example of that for me personally is something that you guys both know and love is with this is Star Wars, and as much as I enjoy all of the Star Wars content that's come out in the last like 10 years, there's no denying that the Rise of Skywalker, even with JJ coming back, he did the Force Awakens, and most people just had a blast. Great return to Star Wars. It was a good time. It was fun. It was reminiscent of A New Hope, but most people were like, that was at least a good fun time. But then him coming back for the last one, people had like this hope that he was going to save the day after they said Rian Johnson ruined it. But then, there was so much studio interference, and even though he did one really solid movie, he ended up making a more messy Star Wars movie later on. So going back to the Peyton Reed thing and all that, that he was just talking about. What about you, Chad? What are your thoughts on him as a director and like the kind of where did it all go wrong?
I have a lot to say. So I guess to start things off, I think that the big thing with Antman, why it works so well, is because Edgar Wright, although he didn't direct it, he did write the first one. Right. I am pretty sure he did not direct the second and third. And I will also bet money that the best thing, in my opinion, about the first Ant-Man besides Paul Rudd is the element of the heist scenes, like how they did that. And I would bet money that Edgar Wright is the one that came up with that. That has Edgar Wright written all over it. So it's like Peyton Reed seems like a yes man director, one that it's like the studio can hire and it's like, hey, we want you to do this, this, this. And he will say, yes, we'll do that. Whenever a studio pivots towards an auteur director and it doesn't go well, they then are like, okay, we got to find a safe director. Going back to what Dee was saying with Iron Man, you had Jon Favreau, who is again, a yes man director. He gets the job done. He is competent. But then you have Shane Black. He did Iron Man 3 and he made fans so irate. So it was like, okay, we got to find someone else. And it's like, okay, we'll go to the Russo brothers. They are fine. Let's go. And then it's like something like Ant-Man, same thing. We got to find someone that can get the job done, and that's just about it. And that's why you see the law of diminishing returns with each entry. And going to what you were saying, Anthony, yeah, that's why with Star Wars, it was the same thing. Like you had Rian Johnson do what he did with Last Jedi, and it divided the fan base. And then it's like, okay, well, clearly he's not going to do the third one, so let's have someone a little bit, safer and do J.J. Abrams. So it's just, in my opinion, I think Peyton Reed, he gets the job done, but he doesn't really do anything special with Ant-Man. I think it's more of like Paul Rudd, Edgar Wright's writing, and then the visual effects doing like the heavy lifting. He does a competent job, but that's my thoughts on him. I have nothing against him, but he doesn't really strike me as like, oh, he has such a great vision. Like I don't really know what he goes for in his three entries because it's so like, in terms of his style.
Oh. Yeah, go ahead, dude. Yeah, for sure.
I was also going to say another example of the whole fan base thing because I immediately thought of this. But Prometheus and Alien Covenant, Ridley Scott has a vision in place, and all of a sudden it's like, no, there are no xenomorphs, there's no this and there's no that, and you get something like Alien Covenant, which to me was just, and I had some issues, I had some issues with Prometheus, but I was at least excited for, okay, what is this going to become? And then see how they just threw that all away with Covenant. I was like, all
right. I know I'm probably in the minority, but I actually liked Prometheus, and Alien Covenant I didn't like on first watch, but on rewatch actually quite liked it. It was like a mad scientist type movie, but
I think there was potential there. I just think I kind of like what Dee was saying. It's almost like they just wanted to revert to like more of a classic Alien vibe, but the story wasn't as interesting as what they were setting up in Prometheus. Because I actually really like Prometheus. I like a lot of the scenes. I like kind of the setup of like this world and kind of seeing like the early xenomorphs and stuff like that. And what I can't remember what they call the big tall white
engineers.
The engineers, right? Yeah. I'm actually going to be doing a full rewatch soon ahead of Romulus to do a big like talk about all the Alien movies in one video. It's going to be a big project that I'm working on coming soon. I'm looking forward to checking that out. But yeah, it's a good example, of something where it's like you have that studio interference, you have people saying stuff, and it just ends up interfering. It just ends up kind of killing the creative vision. And we learned here that Chad clearly has nothing but hatred for Peyton Reed. I'm just kidding.
I have nothing against him. I believe me, Anthony. Like I always look at film as like an art form, but I also understand that it's also $200 million that a studio is throwing at it. So it's like, do we want it to be a vision, an auteur's vision, or do we want it to be where it's a safe bet, where it's like we're going to get our money back and then some? So it's like I get it, but I don't know. Like
Yeah.
I really do wish that we got Edgar Wright directing these 3 films.
Right. And I mean, and you are right that he was pivotal in that, because right before I watched the movie again, I went online to find like the leaked footage of that. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that, but there was test footage. If you look it up after this, Edgar Wright released test footage of Ant-Man. This was when he was still in the chair to direct it. It was just for like the Marvel people to see, and I think they showed it at a Comic-Con when he was still in the director's chair. And it's that sequence when near the end, when he's fighting those two guards, and he like goes and jumps on the one shoulder and punches him on the chin, and then he goes and grabs the other guy by the tie and flips him over and throws him through. So it's an Edgar Wright version of that, and you can tell it's Edgar Wright, like in terms of the way that it's shot. It's done differently. They redid it, but the same kind of motion and vibe, but it was different when the Peyton Reed version. So yeah, look that up on YouTube for anybody who hasn't seen it. It's available there. But yeah, so that was in the Edgar Wright version, and Peyton Reed took that clip and put it in his actual movie. So yeah, I think you're spot on that you could see that Edgar Wright essence in there, because he, I think, really established what the movie was before he moved in. And before we get too much further, we're already, we only have 20 more minutes of this. We're only going for like an hour today, guys. But just a couple of comments that popped in here. The View with Drew said, "Hey everyone, what's up?" LBT Electric Dino said, "Nice review of Ant-Man." Thanks, appreciate it. Also said that he loved Ant-Man and happy 9th anniversary to Ant-Man from 2015. Did you see that popped in here to say, "Hey fellas"? He also said that he remembers seeing this movie in cinemas back in 2015, not having high hopes, however, finding himself enjoy it, and that he hasn't revisited it since, unfortunately, or however. He also was baffled that D does not have a green screen background today. He goes, "What the hell?" He continues to surprise me. P.S. I dig the setup. He also referenced the Thomas the Tank Engine appearance, which I do think was fantastic.
Yes.
And he also said that he goes, "Do you think what they did with Yellow Jacket and Quantumania harmed him as Yellow Jacket in this movie?" Of course, we already touched on that. I think we all kind of universally agree that that was a poor choice, and he agreed that Quantumania sucks. Alden Tuttle also popped in here to say that Ant-Man is absolutely in his top 10 favorite MCU films. That he loves it so much. Sure has issues, but is better than the next two. And Troy Hill Talks just popped in here saying, "Hello, hey, how's it going? Appreciate everybody who left a comment." Now, one thing that's a big part of this movie we've yet to discuss, and we can't not touch on it, is we're touching about the studio interference. And I think the only thing that clearly kind of stands out as a must in here is the setup for Civil War by introducing Ant-Man to the Avengers, most notably through Falcon, who, of course, in the post-credit scene gives us that "I know a guy" line, which they use again in Civil War, and that's when they introduce him. So, Chad, we'll start with you this time. What are your thoughts on that segment? Do you feel that it ever felt forced? Do you think it feels kind of natural within the movie because they also give him a purpose to go there to retrieve that technology, or does it just kind of feel like a shoe-in kind of scene for you?
To be honest, I think it feels like a shoe-in scene, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, the behind the scenes was that Peyton Reed wanted Falcon to be in this, and then the studio was like, "Oh, 26. We wanted him to be in it anyway," so it just kind of turned out to be like, "Oh, it worked out." But it's one of those situations where I feel like it's forced, but I do think that it works in the context of like Civil War, like the payoff itself in Civil War. I'm like, okay, that's fine with, but yeah, I do think it's kind of a forced entry. But I like Anthony Mackie as Falcon, so I was like, okay, whatever. But Steve, what did you think about it?
I was going to say, yeah, I would say technically speaking, yes. Probably not as significant as some, again, given what we've seen. But it was one of that when I said that there were things I'd forgotten. I had completely forgotten that. So when they showed, him arriving to the factory, and then all of a sudden, like something clicked in my head before they actually showed what it was. I was like, oh gosh, then they're arriving to the facility. And I was like, oh, okay, it brought it all back. I would say, of course, because I still remember the audience response and everyone everyone just, because I guess what was fun about it was just kind of, you get so caught up in this individual, again, smaller, low stakes world, and you kind of forget like, oh, we are connected to this, this bigger thing. And so in and of itself, probably not necessary, but there is a bigger payoff. And I thought the scene was funny, and at least showing, I guess showing what Scott was capable of doing, even against an Avenger. You know, like how could this be possible? And being able to see that, and then of course getting the tie-in later. But it was one of those things where it was a fun kind of reminder of what it was like, at least then, seeing certain characters pop up and really not expecting it. 'Cause, yeah, that was one I was just like, brought me right back.
Do you guys think that there's a character that would have been better to have had in that sequence other than Falcon? Or do you think they chose like the better, like smaller stakes character? Because if he was fighting somebody, right, like to get this stuff, like it couldn't have been like the Hulk. I mean, I guess they could have done something like that and made it funny, but like he couldn't have fought somebody that would have taken him out big time. Or like if Iron Man would have detected him with his, helmet, he would have probably blown him to see old Hob. So is there another character you guys think could have played that role, or do you think that they chose correctly?
I feel like they're probably, I'd have to think about it, but it's almost like what they do in Deadpool, where they like reference the fact that, hey, where are all the other X-Men? There's nobody in here. And they have the tie-in, but there are no like big bad honchos. Like they find a way to kind of connect without fully, going all the way there, and the whole mutant piece and all that. So to me, it was kind of like the same thing. How can we kind of touch and connect to that world without having like the most significant, like big names that we know from the Avengers suddenly pop up? So, I mean, I don't know, like maybe Black Widow. I don't think, obviously it couldn't be anyone massive, but I feel like it needed to be someone that could at least go toe to toe and display their skills, but not, like I said, not be one of the big bads as far as terms of strength and abilities and all those things.
Right. What about you, Chad? What do you think?
I honestly think that it's fine that they had, it'd be Falcon. And the reason why I say that is because, going off of what Dee was saying, you really can't have it be someone big, because the whole thing with Civil War is it's like they're just talking like, oh, we need more people, and it's like, I know a guy. Like it needs to be like something casual where it's like they're bringing up to Captain America. So I think it works in the grand scheme of things, and I do kind of wonder about that with the new phase of things, where it's like things that I have issues with now with the new phase. I wonder if once we get to the big Avengers movie, if it's going to be like, oh, the large scale of things, there really isn't an issue. That's what I'm kind of wondering.
Right. No, yeah, I think we're all kind of aligned on that too. Like it couldn't have been somebody too big, and I think that in the end of the day, it did work out. If you would have told me beforehand, who should this be, I wouldn't have thought Falcon initially. I think Black Widow is a good example of another one that it could have been. But I think that they did what they had to also keep it closely tied to somebody who would be with Captain America in the next movie, which I'm sure they had all of that planned. Now, one thing we haven't discussed yet here, that's probably one of the most emotional pieces of the film, is the relationship between Hank Pym and his daughter, who is kind of estranged in a way. The character of Hope, played by Evangeline Lilly, who I was first introduced to and fell in love with through Lost back in the day. So I was very excited to see her when she was announced to be in this movie. So Chad, we'll start with you this time. What were your thoughts on that whole element? What do you think about Evangeline Lilly and the father-daughter dynamic in the movie?
So Evangeline Lilly, I first was aware of her with Real Steel, the one with Hugh Jackman. And I'll be honest, I like her. I think that she's a fine actress, and I also am a big fan of Michael Douglas. But I just found that relationship to be so odd. Like, I understand the whole estranged aspect, but the fact that he was like, it can't be you. It can't be you to have this suit. It can't be. But then at the end, it's like, well, actually, I'm not going to give you the Antman suit, but I'm going to give you a separate suit. And it's like, it kind of shoots the whole premise of the film in the foot. It's like, why would you have this? Where they clearly established that she can't be Antman because he wants to protect her. But then it's like afterwards, it's like, whatever. So I was kind of frustrated by that whole aspect. But I'm curious to hear what Dee thinks on that, because I that really bugged me towards the end.
All right, cool. No, I mean, I could feel you. Yeah, I think that they kind of do linger on that a lot, and then eventually near the end, once it's all said and done, it's like, all right, well, now you can have the suit. Why did he change? I love that scene though, where he like tells her what happened to Janet. I thought that was really well done between both actors. I thought that the emotion there, her saying, "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" I thought that was great. And then of course, just the classic Paul Rudd ending it with like the, this is a beautiful moment kind of thing. Like just being able to like feel the emotion and then the silliness of it. But what do you think? What did you feel about that element of the film?
I I like you said, and that's my first thought was that scene where you see, of course, the layers, as Scott says, being peeled back and them going through their healing. I thought that was effective. I feel like probably with the juxtaposition of the story, it was probably not. You could argue that there maybe wasn't as much time given to understanding more about Hope and their dynamic, but then you have all these other things going on also. Uh, I would say once I got past Hope's hair, I was able to embrace the rest of what was going on because it took me a minute. Um, and my introduction to Evangeline Lilly was also real still, but it was, I feel like, I don't know which, I feel like I saw The Hobbit first and then I saw real still like shortly afterwards. So her role is Tariel. So yeah, I've kind of uh, I found her like shortly before this film. And so I think she works. I feel like her seriousness and kind of her dynamic with her father and with Scott, I think it makes it fun because she's the more serious, grounded character, partly because she's hanging on to her own personal issues that she hasn't worked through. But yeah, I think it was fine for what it was. Probably could have seen more with it, but I was cool with it. And I think what makes it work is that scene. I think without that, it kind of feels more like, eh. But no, I think that scene is very effective, and them kind of working through, the past and overcoming those things. I think it's something that adds to the depth of this, even with the silliness that's going on.
Yeah, no, for sure. I definitely agree. And I mean, let me just say real quickly while we have like less, we're only gonna go for about like another 10 minutes, guys. But I'm so grateful to have had you guys on to talk about this movie. Genuinely, like just hearing you guys' thoughts is a lot of fun. And it's fun to go back and talk about these movies that like were, pivotal, stones to kind of set up this whole like thing that we've gotten all these years later. And this movie is so pivotal for what we've ended up getting with Infinity War and Endgame. And there's been so much debate on what's happened since then. But like, it's kind of nice, similar to when I went back and rewatched Civil War the other day or last week. It's just nice to go back to this time where like you could see the vision. The vision was clear. Whereas now I think a big issue that most people are having is even if you have good projects in the MCU, the vision doesn't seem clear to most people. Even somebody like me who's been kind of I guess you can almost say like I've been a supporter of most of these projects, where I feel like I'm tend to be one of the only ones who's a little bit more positive, and maybe that's just my love for this universe and the comics and stuff that kind of helps fuel that. But there's undeniably not much of a vision, whereas this feels like the vision is still there. And then having watched Civil War, even though I watched them backwards, you could just see where that vision was all headed, and it just they laid the groundwork in a good way. Now, one thing I want to touch on before we wrap this up, and I should also say again for anybody who's watching up to this point, the links to these two guys' channels are down below. Go give them some love. Let them know I sent you. You got the Movieman doing all kinds of episode reviews of shows and movie reviews, top tier content over there. Really funny. And Chad, as a filmmaker himself, has all this different filmmaking stuff over on his channel, rankings, reviews, and all kinds of breakdowns. And he gets real in depth. And so definitely some great stuff. And I just noticed also that Troy Hills popped in here to say that don't feel bad. I enjoyed the Marvels. I did too, man. I didn't love it, but I enjoyed it. I'll say that. I think it got a little too much crap. But D, I want to throw it to you first this time. Favorite scene of the movie. Okay, so we're going to do this. We're going to do favorite scene and your favorite dynamic. So for me personally, I'm going to say my favorite scene of the film is the first time he tries the suit and he's going through all these different things. I just love how that looks. My favorite dynamic and story element would have to be the father-daughter relationship between Scott and his daughter. So what about you? What favorite dynamic in the film, favorite story beat, and what's your favorite sequence? If you need a second, I could throw it over to Chad too.
Yeah, do Chad first. I'm a little stuck.
Okay.
All right.
So I would say, hands down, my favorite dynamic is Michael Pena and Paul Rudd. I think that those two together is just real. Like, I thoroughly am entertained. I would love to see a TV show just with those two. My favorite scene is anytime Michael Pena is telling a story. Again, I love those sequences. Like, those are the ones where I'm like, oh wow, that's so cool. Like, but yeah, I'm a simple man. I see Michael Pena telling a story, with his dialogue over other people's lips and everything. It's just, I don't know. To me, it's also just brilliant editing, because I understand how difficult that is to edit over, where it's like you have to loop it over, but you have to make sure lips match and everything. I'm like, so it's a stroke of genius and it's hilarious.
Yeah, no, I agree. I love that that's your choice. You know, like of all the things that happen in this movie, the fact that that's your choice is awesome. Like, and it's great. Those are great sequences and a great dynamic. And I love those three just in general that hang around with him throughout the course of the film. They're super funny. T.I. makes me laugh in this movie more than I ever expect. You know, going back and revisit it, he's so funny. But D, did you decide what your favorite elements of this film are?
Yes. So I have to say, because it's just, to me, it was just such a, I don't know, the way you just get so thrust into what this film is doing and what the character and the hero, so to speak, and his abilities represent. So yeah, I have to say, go with that first bathtub scene, kind of connecting it with the, the bed, Cassie's bedroom fight scene, kind of the same dynamic where we see where he, shrinks down, and then we see how everything is happening from these different vantage points and scales. So I really love both, but I'll kind of go with the bathtub scene. I do think Luis and Scott are great. I will. This is gonna sound funny. One thing I actually appreciated more this time around was Scott and Anthony's relationship, like his bond, and so it hurt a little bit more when he gets killed. So yeah, randomly it just was kind of those things where I'm like, oh, this stands. I don't know why, but it just stood out to me a little bit more this time around. And so that was something I actually appreciated. And I think that I guess the other question was story arc.
Yeah, or just like I mean, I guess you nailed it. The dynamic between characters, or any story beat, maybe that was your favorite.
I would also say where they get into the science of the ants, because I grew up as an ant fan. I still love ants, ant farms, all that stuff. The way they get into like the kind of the science, so to speak, of the different kinds of ants, what they do, what they're capable of, and even all the intricate moments where they cover up the cameras and they do all these things. I think that also added to this feeling kind of special and distinctive, because it also ties into a real life, interesting, dynamic with ants and what they represent and what they actually can do. So yeah, I think that was something that made it even more special for me.
Yeah, no, I'd have to agree. Those are some pretty great moments you chose there as well, and great elements. And I love the relationship between Scott and Anthony. I think it's such a funny thing that he names it, and then of course, when he got killed. I remember seeing the first time I saw it. I remember thinking like, no, not Anthony. Like his name is so similar to mine. But so we have to, now that we've touched on this stuff though, what is your least favorite part of the movie? D, I'll throw it right back to you, and then we'll go to Chad, unless you need a second. Again, if you need a second, we'll throw it over to Chad. But I would say for me, going back and revisiting it, there are some elements with the I guess my least favorite element is sometimes I wish that they spent a little bit more time with the ex-wife and that cop character, her fiance now. I feel like that element is there for a couple of moments of comedic work that do work, but I felt like it could have been done a little bit stronger there, and that was one element that felt a little bit disjointed. Outside of that, I would just say that there was it also oftentimes felt like they were kind of forcing certain characters to be in certain sequences that didn't need to, just for the sake of them being around with something else. And outside of that, my biggest gripe would have to be the villain, the yellow jacket element, just because he just feels so generic and he feels so undercooked. We already touched on this earlier, but as I was watching the movie, I was like, I like what this actor is doing. I like the overall idea, kind of like you mentioned, of that relationship, that father kind of like relationship with Hank Pym, but they just never do enough with it other than just kind of, it feels very much like a show, don't tell kind of thing. And at a certain point, it just feels like he goes from like, they set up that the suit or like is like kind of messing with his brain chemistry, but they don't lean on that enough. So when he's like gonna kill, he's like, oh, I showed up to Hank's house to kill him, but you were there. It's like, oh, bro, like you went from like kind of like this jealous guy to like suddenly like a murderer. And I don't feel like they did that transition all that well. So Chad, I'll throw it over to you. Maybe least favorite scene, least favorite element of the film.
So to be honest, I definitely get with what you're saying. I would agree with it about the villain probably being I would say the biggest disappointment aspect, but I would say honestly the score, like for me, cinematography and score are like the two things that I lean towards where it's like they have to be. If those two elements aren't like impactful for me, then it's kind of like eh. And that's just it with this movie. The score was just so forgettable. Like if you played the Ant-Man theme for me, I wouldn't know it was the Ant-Man theme. I would just be like, okay, is this what movie is this? Like I wouldn't know. Versus something like, I mentioned them earlier, but if you played like Avengers Endgame or Black Panther, like those scores, I would immediately know. I would be like, okay, I know those. So I would say for me, the score was kind of the biggest negative for me. But it's not like I hated it. It just didn't really stick out that much, just like the villain, unfortunately.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I can't take that away from you. I like the Ant-Man theme, but I do agree that the score as a whole isn't anything that's like mind blowing. But I do like that bum 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 bum. Like I just like, I don't know, there's something about it because they utilize that later on when he would appear in things, and I've always kind of enjoyed that little jingle. But I do think it's one of those across the entirety of the MCU that if you were to just sing it to somebody without telling them it's Ant-Man, they might not recognize that that's Ant-Man's. Whereas even like Spider-Man's is more noticeable these days. There's that great Spider-Man theme that plays throughout the newer films.
And honestly, I was going to say like Iron Man, for example, Iron Man 1 and 2, the theme, it's like background noise. But then Iron Man 3, like that I found to be memorable. The first Captain America, I think, has a pretty memorable theme. So I don't know. Just when I compare it to those, I'm just like, I get what you're saying.
And Avengers is definitely the most memorable one, right? It's the one that they play at the perfect moments that give everybody chills all the time. I mean, they going back to that first Avengers film with that great circle shot with all of them, and then the way that kind of just been slowly translated into these moments later on, especially with the Avengers Assemble moment, where it's just perfectly. I mean, it could not be more perfectly done. Anytime I watch that sequence, I just find myself like I can't turn it off because it's just so well done.
It makes you want to charge into the screen.
Honestly, dude. Honestly, I'll never forget seeing that for the first time in theaters and just being like, I was so teary-eyed. I remember like touching, like I grabbed onto my fiance's thigh because I was just losing my shit, and just crazy. But D, what about you? What least favorite part of the movie?
Hope's hair aside, I would say that probably my least favorite. I guess just for me, I feel like there was I think there was a missed opportunity to delve more into Hank's legacy as the Ant-Man. Just seeing maybe, I don't want to make it just about flashbacks, but just seeing more about what he accomplished or what it was like, or when, just something to tie back. Because I like, the 1989 scene, but I would have preferred to see something more, like all the way back to when he was, in that experience. And that's why I also like that one scene where they reference Janet, because you see them in action. So I think they should have just taken more of an opportunity to see kind of, in that period piece style, like what it was like for him to be a hero in that time. And then kind of have that connection with the old, kind of like the Mask of Zorro. We have the old Zorro and then the new Zorro, kind of like bridging the gap that way. I think that would have been a nice touch.
Yeah, I definitely agree for sure. I mean, I think we've all made really good points, and guys, it has been just a blast to talk to you guys about this. It was a blast to go back and revisit this film on my own, but there's nothing better that I love that with YouTube than just being able to talk with people about movies, and whether it's in the comments or doing this. And I'm happy to have you guys on as the part of the legacy of my Ant-Man reviews here on the channel. Really quickly, as I said before, guys, the links to these two guys are down below. I see that Troy Hill Talks popped in here to say that he subbed to the guest as well. So glad to know that. And he said, take it easy. And then one last comment, Mike hopped in here to say, with you doing these throwback Marvel reviews, it really makes me appreciate the greatness it once was, not in recent times. However, that feels 76 feet under compared to good old times. I know Mike has been not a fan of the current Marvel stuff, which is why he was very happy to go back and revisit a much better film in Civil War last week. But just really quickly, D, I'll throw it to you. Anything you want to plug over on your channel, anything you got coming out that people can look forward to, and then once you're done, Chad, go ahead and do the same, and then we'll wrap this up, guys.
All right. Well, hey, everyone. This is the Movieman, fellow cinephile, popcorn addict, and emerging film critic, coming to you with reliable recaps, reviews, and reactions. If you are not familiar with that tagline, then that is my general kind of summation of my channel. I love discussing film. I love discussing the occasional TV show. I like delving into trailers, which I've recently gotten back into. I even had the opportunity to visit Sundance in person, and I am in the process of, I've already uploaded one half of the 18 films, yes, that I saw while I was there. So I have part one. I'll be having part two coming up next. I also discussed the American Society of Magical Negroes. What an experience that was. I also did a trailer reaction to Beetlejuice, which I'm very excited for. And yes, I am also will be doing an early review for the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which was also a very unique experience and not quite what I was expecting. So yes, you can stay tuned for that as well. Please feel free to support. Check me out. I would love to have you.
That's awesome, man. I'm looking forward to your Sundance stuff for sure. And I'm actually watching that Unfortunate or whatever, that movie, Ungentlemanly. I'm watching that on Tuesday. I think I got an early screening before it drops next week. So I'm looking forward. I've heard a lot of mixed reviews so far, and I feel it's Guy Ritchie, right? I feel like he's been a little hit or miss these days. You know, like some of his back in the day, if he used to be a little bit more beloved, I feel like now people still appreciate him as a like kind of legendary actor, or I mean director in a way, but he doesn't necessarily what's it called? He doesn't always please the fans, so to speak. At least me personally. And real quick, I saw Mike popped in here saying, once again, it has to be said whenever I can. He's a legend, D Movieman. We all know D is a huge fan of Justice Smith. He said, Mike the Movie Menace strikes.
I'm sorry. I completely forgot about this. I also have been testing something new. I recently dropped a review for Monkey Man, and I'm trying a new format called Take 6, where I can press my thoughts on certain movies within a certain time limit, so I can just kind of get more in the mix. I love doing my deep dives. You guys know I love to talk and analyze, but just so I can get a little bit more out there as far as, you know, every week and more films and getting more into the movie man side of things, there will be that as well.
All right. Yeah, I'm excited for that. Yeah, I think you already dropped the Take 6 already, right?
If the first one for Monkey Man, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I haven't watched that yet. I won't lie, but I need to. I'm super behind on people's videos right now. But I would do plan on catching up. Mike also saying that he thinks Guy Ritchie sucks. But we'll throw it over to you, Chad, now. What do you got coming out on your channel? What can people expect? Feel free to plug whatever you like, my friend.
Oh, absolutely. So on my channel, I like to do a lot of top 10 lists. One that a lot of people seem to be clicking on is my top 10 horror films of all time. I am looking forward to do a top 10 action films of all time, as well as top 10 Westerns of all time. I also do a deep dive on directors, where I'll focus on a certain director and rank all their films from worst to best. I do film and TV show reviews as well, but with TV shows, I wait until I've seen the whole show before, talking about it, on if it's worth watching or not. I do also keep up to date with a lot of, new films, but I don't release those on YouTube. I do release them though on Letterboxd. It's my first name, last name. So also I am right now in pre-production for a short film. So that probably won't come out until next year though. But yeah, so very busy on my channel. So again, if you like top 10 lists, director lists, as well as TV show reviews, then, subscribe to my channel. I'm always down to talk movies and TV shows. And thanks again, Anthony, for having me on the channel. Always love collaborating with you.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely. It was a blast to have you guys on. Genuinely, honestly, if I didn't have to go to dinner tonight with family and stuff, I would say let's keep going. But I appreciate you guys so much. Genuinely, it was a lot of fun. Everybody, next week you guys can tune in. I believe 11 a.m. next Friday, a little bit earlier, just to fit people's schedules. But Jacob Martin, the Big Rob Theory, we'll be talking about Doctor Strange from 2016, I believe, is when it came out. And looking forward to touching on that one, the original Doctor Strange film with Benedict Cumberbatch. Looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a really great time. But as for today, this is going to be a wrap for today. I appreciate you guys so much. And we'll see all you guys in the next one. Thank you guys so much for watching. And go subscribe to these guys.